Yeah, so good morning, CascadiaJS. I originally gave this talk at JSConf EU, and Carter liked it so much that he invited me here to give it to you guys. My name is Angelina Fabbro. I am Angelina Magnum on Twitter, so you can follow me there if you want to ask me questions or if you would like the slides afterwards. I work at a company called Steam Clock Software, and we make apps. We make apps using JavaScript, Objective-C, and sometimes both. And we're based in Vancouver, Canada. Before that, I did web development for almost exclusively for a very long time. My first website was on AngelFire, and it was about dolphins because I was like 12 at the time, and that seemed like what I thought people would want to look at on the internet. It had gratuitous use of the blink tag, and I'm pretty sure every dolphin GIF was animated. I actually really wish I had a copy of it still. So let's talk a little bit about how we currently build websites and web applications. A really common way that I see people doing things. So maybe you have some sort of a spec, you have a hobby project, or someone who's your project manager has said, okay, Angelina, I need you to build a website that performs these set of functions. And then, if you're an experienced developer, probably you have your go-tos, right? You've maybe built things with a calendar widget before, or you've built things with a contact form. And so maybe you have a JavaScript component library that you happen to like. So I'm not necessarily saying jQuery is the best way to do things, but people are familiar with jQuery and jQuery UI and like this pattern of sort of UI component frameworks. And so then you might do something like this. You have a script tag, and you insert the jQuery code. And then if you're using a plugin to extend jQuery, in the case of these sort of modular components like calendar widgets and stuff, you're very often including third-party code. So maybe in this case, it's a slideshow of some sort. And then you still need to write some extra script in order to select an element and do some magic with it. Maybe you insert elements. Maybe you change their positioning in order to get the behavior that you're looking for. And so very rarely when we're building these rich websites and web applications do we have just one calendar widget. Something like Gmail or a really rich web application, like maybe you've built some CRM, probably has multiple widgets, right? Like maybe you've got a calendar picker and you've got a contact form, maybe you've got like a news widget. And so probably you're going to end up with lots of styles. And so maybe you do something like this. We write these styles that we think, okay, these are the styles that are definitely going to apply to all my widgets all the time. Every widget will use these. But then when you realize there are subtle differences between styling your contacts widget and your news component widget, you start to write selectors with more and more specificity. And when you do this, and you have got multiple people working on the code base, you start using really common words like contact and widget, and you can kind of get like namespace collisions and CSS selectors messing with each other. So this is one way to do things. This is like probably one of the most common ways I see people do things. And that's okay, I guess, right? Like it works. We're still building websites, and somehow we manage these conflicts and stuff like that. But as I mentioned, you can get things like namespace and selector collisions. More and more CSS and JavaScript that you have in your app, especially if you're introducing third-party code, increases the risk and likelihood of that happening. But we like to pretend that we know what we're doing. We can catch those things. It'd be kind of nice if we just didn't have to worry about it as much. And introducing that third-party code, sometimes there might be elements you might not expect when iterating over the DOM. A lot of these third-party applications, they insert code into elements, and you can vet your modules and stuff really thoroughly, but I still think it's not so nice. And so yeah, those widgets can sometimes mess with each other. And so, I think that we can do better. In fact, I know we can do better now that I've looked at this stuff. But we need something in particular. And what we need is actually encapsulation in our front end. That is to say, how do we create a boundary between the code we create and the code that consumes it? This is actually a quote from Dmitry Glazkov, who is the author of the Shadow DOM spec, and he does lots of work on the Chrome project and these sorts of things. And up until now, iframes were really the only way to do this in the browser, right? Like if you put something in an iframe, the container element doesn't really know anything about it unless you're really, really explicit. And even then, it's really clumsy and messy to get in and out of the iframe. On top of that, as far as I know, if you try and create some sort of a component widget in iframes and you have some really nice visual styles, that you apply to this widget, they can't. I don't think they can overlap the boundary of the iframe. Like I've never seen anybody really do that. So that's also kind of a problem. Is you kind of just end up with this box that's inline in your page, and that's not really the most elegant way to do things. So let's actually take a look at something we've seen before. So I'm talking about encapsulation, right? And encapsulation is this idea that I should be able to contain some code and have it sort of be its separate own unit that the parent context doesn't really either know or care about unless we explicitly say otherwise, and sort of create like this boundary so that we don't have namespace and selector collisions, and we sort of create like a scope for our component, and that's what we're doing today. So right here I have a HTML5 video, and I'm going to inspect it. And I have a special thing turned on my browser. I should mention right now, I'm running Chrome Canary, and if I go into the settings here, I have this experimental feature turned on called Show Shadow DOM. And so if you're following along and you have a copy of these slides, because they are floating around somewhere, you can go and enable that stuff. And if I expand the video tag here, there's this thing called shadow root, which you weren't able to look at before, and this is shadow DOM. So, you know, pardon me. Oops. Oh, and suddenly we get the cat again. Haha. So up until recently, the video tag was essentially a black box. Recently, WebKit made available a bunch of selectors that allow you to do more sophisticated styling of the elements inside the video element, but we really had no way of sort of looking at it. And so this video element I wanted to show you because you're actually already familiar with Shadow DOM. You've encountered it in the wild in this video tag and in things like the range input slider, but you just didn't know it before. And so now browser developers have exposed this to you so that you can look at it, and also so that you can create Shadow DOM elements of your own. Okay, so the gist of Shadow DOM, right? So Shadow DOM. Basically, the way to think about Shadow DOM is that it is a tiny document that lives inside of a host element. And I just watched like 3 people's faces go like, what is she talking about? That sounds crazy. So before the video tag was a black box, we couldn't see that all of those divs and the shadow root container was in there. And if you iterate over a DOM that has like 5 video elements, you're only going to find 5 video elements. You're not going to find you're only going to find those 5 video elements, and you're not going to be able to traverse the stuff that's inside those video elements. So that would be, we would say that the video is encapsulated. And so Shadow DOM is basically a tiny document that lives inside of a host element. Like we take a tree of DOM nodes, and it lives inside of its host, and then the parent context, the parent document, doesn't know anything about it unless we say otherwise. So again, like if I iterate over all of the range input sliders, it's not like that code, unless I do some special things to it, is not going to detect the range input sliders that are encapsulated in that video. So as I mentioned, browsers use them, and developers can too. So let's actually create a minimal shadow here. So let me just open up the inspector and also double check what the idea is here. So right now in the inspector, we have just this div, and it's empty. And I put a border around it just so that, I don't know, I guess there's something for you guys to look at. I just want to make sure my browser, or pardon me, my server is still running. Yeah, it should be okay. Okay, so let's first select our element. We'll call it spooky. Yeah, thanks guys. I've given this talk 3 or 4 times, and every time I'm up here, I like forget a closing tag or something else, and someone's like, hey, you forgot that thing. I'm like, which I actually really appreciate, because it's much better than me standing up here and being like, what's going on? So okay, so we've selected our tag, and then what we want to do is create a new shadow root. And we do that using new WebKit shadow root. And then we pass in spooky because that is the element that we want to give a shadow root to. Okay, so now we have a shadow root. And if we go over in here and we expand Spooky, we can see that there's a shadow root. But that's not really all that exciting, right? Because there's nothing in there. And so if we want to add some content to it, let's say I put in an H1. Hi, everyone. So I've added that. And that's really, I mean, I suppose that that's not super exciting. But if I were to run this script, and like let's say I run this script on page load and I insert this element, and then I inspect this element with Shadow DOM turned off. Of course, this would be encapsulated. You would go into the source and see that there's this empty div named Spooky, and that there is no text inside there that says, hi, everyone. That is only in the Shadow DOM, and the parent context doesn't know anything about it. So that's how you create a simple shadow root. And how this works is when a shadow root is inserted into a host node, the rendering of the shadow's children replaces the rendering of the child nodes of the host element. So it doesn't actually remove anything or change the structure in the parent document. The rendering just replaces that element. And so you just saw me insert the shadow root, and you're like, that's great. So if the rendering is replacing the rendering of the host element's children, that's fine and all when we have an element with no children, but what happens when the element does have children? I mean, if we replace the rendering, what happens to those host element children? Maybe I don't want to totally wipe them out. And so what we can do in our shadow root is if we specify a content tag, the browser will magically take all of the child elements from the host element and insert them right here in this content tag. And similarly, if you want to insert like sub-shadow DOM, like a shadow DOM into a shadow DOM, which just sounds kind of like voodoo to me, you can actually do that using the shadow tag to specify an insertion point. And so let's actually try that again. So what did I call this list? This list is called Spooky with Children. Okay, so we'll call it Spooky 2. Okay, great. And then I didn't refresh this, so I probably need to call it something else. Oh, yeah. Sorry, guys, I really didn't have a lot of sleep. Like, while I'm typing this, I spent forever at the border. We didn't get into something like 2. So, okay, so now I've inserted a shadow root, and you can see that the list has disappeared. And that's interesting because, like, you know, what I just explained to you, the rendering of the shadow DOM element has replaced the rendering of our child elements. And like, oh no, what happened to the children? Somebody please think of the children. Let's bring them back. So let's give this. Let's say we put in H1 again, and we say that this is our list. And then let's just put content tag here and see what happens. So the children from that element should appear at the content tag right after the H1 var list. And voila, it does. So that's pretty great. So the interesting thing about this is that it sort of allows you to remix content without affecting the structure of your markup. If you have somebody at your company that does marketing and SEO, and like maybe you've got some really awesome page ranking, and they're like, oh yeah, no, we need to do all these website upgrades, but you totally can't touch the markup, or I don't want anybody to mess with it because we rank, you know, 5 for like these 10 keywords. And you have this argument with people ongoing at your company, then this is possibly one way for you to be able to sort of appease those people. So what I just showed you was creating a shadow DOM imperatively with JavaScript. Just doing it really quickly in the console there. But we have some new magic words coming for HTML templates. And these will allow you to insert Shadow DOM declaratively using these tags. And so that's really important because you can give this stuff to your designers at your company, and they can be inserting Shadow DOM and remixing content this way. And so I want to make sure, sometimes people have had the question afterwards, like, okay, so you showed me this imperative, like you coded with some JavaScript, and then you showed me these elements, like what's their relationship? Anytime that you use this custom element, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, and insert one of these template tags, when that's rendered and used by the browser, that will insert a Shadow DOM. So the relationship is that these tags will also use the Shadow DOM. And there is a piece of information for you. So the template tag. The template tag is basically inert markup that is used later by its PAL element. The contents are parsed, but not rendered when the browser encounters them. And like here's an example of a particular pattern that you might see in the future. Someone's created a comment template, and this is just a quick example of something that could be used in a custom element. And we're actually going to build one in just a moment here. So we have the template tag, which creates this inert markup for sort of creating like sort of layout and structure for our component. And then we have the element, which I affectionately call the element, which is actually kind of a clumsy name. So the element, and these are custom DOM elements defined by you. And I think that this stuff is really exciting because it means that we're kind of getting client-side templating built into the browser, which is a really big step. I mean, client-side, and especially thick client frameworks, are sort of like the cool way to do things right now, so I figured that this would probably really excite people. It makes me really excited. This whole encapsulation thing is something that I think the front end has needed for a long time. So using these templates, we can create modular and reusable components that have a fair amount of encapsulation. So I was talking about this idea of remixing content, which sort of brings me to sort of like my story time. I mean, how many people here have been handed some big, giant legacy code base? Like maybe you took over the management of some big... People are kind of like, I'm sorry for giving you flashbacks. And so maybe you do have a situation where someone says, okay, Angelina, I need you to display this content. Like we can't totally redo our site for mobile users. And you know, but we need to be showing them slightly different navigation or slightly different content in the mobile situation. And then the other one was, I mentioned, like, if you want to show the user something different but not touch your markup, like in the case where the SEO person at your company or the marketing person at your company is really sort of attached to your page ranking, doesn't want you to touch the semantic content of your page, then you know, these components might be some way to make everybody happy. So let's actually make a custom element. So right now I have this list here, and let's take a look at it. Let's imagine that I just started at my new job, and someone said, "Oh, okay, Angelina, we want you to take this list. It's just a list of news stories, and we want you to break it up by what stories are breaking and exciting, and what stories are not." And so maybe this is some large legacy code base, and I won't necessarily have very good markup, or I'm not, or whatever is happening on the server side, they're not actually. So maybe the only way that I know these stories are breaking are by their class name, which is really not the greatest way to do things, right? Like you probably just want to group them all together in the markup. So they have the class breaking on them. And so yeah, what we're going to do is we're going to create a custom element that will remix this list slightly and really quickly, since we don't have a lot of time, so that we separate the breaking stories from the regular stories. So I have this empty document right here. It's called newscomponent.html. It's just an empty HTML document. And then over here in my index.html, my giant monolith, I'm running reveal.js, which you guys can probably tell. And I have included here this line here where my cursor is. So very familiar inclusion pattern, kind of like our style sheets. I give it a link to the news component, and I give it this attribute with components here. And then I mentioned that this stuff is pretty bleeding edge, and so browser support is coming, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. but we actually need to include this polyfill right here, which is written by Dmitry Glazkov, who I mentioned works on the Shadow DOM spec. So I've included this script. I have Shadow DOM enabled in the browser. Excuse me. And I also have my component available at the top there. So let's just pop to where that list is. So I have this ID of breaking news, so I can select things, and I know that the class of the elements that I want to separate out is breaking. So let's actually, we'll just call this news component. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to go into the body and use the element tag. So we add the element tag, and what we want to do here is give it a name. So we'll call it news. And if you are creating a custom element that is derived from the behavior of an existing element, we can do that by extending the element. So if I add the extends attribute, we're telling the browser that the custom element that we're making and using is going to have behavior. You can interact with it like it's an unordered list. And so then I'm going to want to insert my template tag, because without it we would have nothing. And okay, so how do we want to do this? Let's add a title, of course. So there wasn't a title before. Let's add one that says breaking news. Exciting stuff. And then we've got one unordered list, and we'll create maybe another unordered list, just because we're going to separate things out. And inside there, we're going to use our friend, the content tag, which we know will select those child elements from our host element, which is an unordered list. And we're going to need another content tag, because we need that in two places. And we have this special attribute called the select attribute. Now, I just want to say that I actually really don't like the naming of some of this stuff. I think that's actually some criticism I'm going to have to forward up the chain, because we kind of already used the word select in a bunch of other contexts. And now we have another one that's called like the select attribute, which is kind of just weird to me. And so what we're going to do is we're going to select class breaking here. And you might be like, okay, Angelina, there's these two content tags. That's great. So, I mean, how does the browser know which content goes where? And it's actually because of the select tag. What will happen is when the browser renders the shadow DOM, when it encounters an element with the breaking tag, it will know to insert them at this insert point, this content tag. And the rest of them, if they don't have any special select case, will just get dumped into the content tag here.
How does it know class from an ID?
That's a very good question. The question was, how does it know a class from an ID? I don't know, actually. It might be a worthy experiment to find out when something has a class or class and ID that have like the same name like that. But I don't think you should be doing that in your code anyway. Like, I don't think that there should ever be any reason to have an ID called breaking and a class called breaking, because you're going to have problems. Yeah. So where was I here? Okay, so I think that should be all we need. I think so. Well, hopefully it works. And so now we go back to our index.html, and with my UL with the ID of breaking news, I'm going to do one last thing here. We have another attribute to apply, and it is called the is attribute. And this is a special attribute to be used with these HTML components and templates. And it's basically a way of telling the element what it's supposed to behave like now, like what the element is. You is some news, which is not very good grammar, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say, right? You is the news, so it is the news now. And then I should be able to save this, and we can see here that these breaking news stories are like the third and sixth one. What's the text in them? It's like also a story and horrible story. So those should actually be in their own list above the other one. And if we inspect it here again, of course, we can see what the list like originally looks like. Woohoo, there it is. So let's actually refresh and see what happens. Huzzah! Okay, so we have a shadow root here. Let me actually close this for a sec. Oh no, it didn't work. Oh, I think I know why. I think...
That's how they know that.
Yeah, there we go. So now we have our breaking news, right? So let's go back. Now we have some breaking news, also a story and a unfortunately horrible story, that are separated out from the rest of the other ones. And if we look in the inspector, let's go back to the elements here. Shit. And we inspect down here at the list. The interesting thing here in the unordered list is that we have a shadow root, right, with this H2, which you probably can't tell on the screen, but in my console here, it's slightly faded out. Like the shadow root children have like a slightly different tint to them. They're a little bit more pastel, which is going to be awful for people who are colorblind. And so there's our H2, and there's actually 2 unordered lists contained in our shadow root. But the interesting thing is that if you look at the markup, the host children still appear in line where you would expect them to. And that's because, like I mentioned before, we're not replacing those elements. We're not removing them. All we're doing is replacing the rendering of them. So our markup is effectively untouched as far as the parent scope is concerned, even though we're showing the user something else. And so I think that really opens up a lot of opportunities for remixing your remixing websites for mobile use cases, and there could be a lot of really cool stuff here. So some interesting points about our boundary. A few questions I've had are like, well, what about CSS? How do CSS rules apply? CSS rules that are defined in your parent page in the style sheet will not cross that shadow DOM boundary unless you use this special attribute of apply author styles, or you can do it imperatively with like whatever your root is, apply author styles true. And then similarly, if so the only styles that end up getting applied to those elements then are, I guess, the user agent styles. And so if you really want to really enforce that those elements have absolutely no styling in relation to like even your user agent, you can use this reset style inheritance. And I was making jokes with people that this is sort of like the fastest CSS reset I've seen so far, and I kind of want this just for general use. So the interesting thing about this so far in this list is I discovered that, and this is in the spec also, that if I apply some styles to these elements here, and I define those styles in the scope of my component, they will apply to the shadow DOM children, but not the children that are included at the content point from the original host element, which actually I think is awful. I'm going to talk to the browser people. While I was at the border yesterday, I basically had an hour to write them a big long email with all the feedback from all the times I've done this. And that's actually the #1 comment that I get from people is like, well, if I'm going to be remixing an element, especially like in the case of a mobile browser or something like, or a mobile browser or a mobile use case, I want to be able to control those elements in the same context of like the shadow DOM. Like I guess I would make the assumption that if I'm selecting those elements to put in a shadow DOM capacity, I'm sort of saying that I would want them to behave in accordance with other elements there. I think that that would be a pretty reasonable assumption. So I'm going to pass that on to them. And I wanted to mention that because it's a really common question that I've had so far. So ideas time. I think that this stuff is really cool because we can get designers to do a bunch of templates and hand them off to UX people and be like, hey, so let's rapidly prototype some websites by telling these elements what they is. Maybe you write a news component 1 or 2 ways, and then that's what you use for prototyping, right? And I mean, when you're designing a site, there's never like one toolbox that always does the trick for everything, but we can have some foundation and libraries of these components and hopefully build bigger and better things by doing less and less boilerplate. And so I mentioned serving up alternate navigation for a mobile website. And because of this encapsulation at these boundaries, it's easier to mix and match frameworks and components a little bit more readily, I think, if we take advantage of this. So state of implementation. We have the creation of shadow roots in Chrome Canary and Dmitry Glazkov's polyfill for component support. Right now, I mean, this stuff exists already in WebKit. And so Chrome has thoughtfully exposed it and started a dialogue about this specification that they want to move forward on, which is great. But of course, that's no good to the rest of us who are like, okay, Angelina, this is cool, but like I can't use this in production, so now you're asleep. But I do want you to use this stuff. I think it's really important that like you see how easy it is and you use it, because if you do use this stuff, browser developers do notice. Like they notice the conversation you have online, complaining on Twitter and talking about it in a blog post, and they actually will act accordingly and give you feedback if you give them feedback. And also, I mentioned that you can use WebKit prefix styles to style elements with Shadow DOM in WebKit browsers. I mean, obviously, these are browser prefix styles that will hopefully and ideally eventually go away in favor of ones that are more general use. But I have a gist here where when I was creating this talk, I sort of like collected all the ones I could find because there actually is no unified resource for these yet. So if you do want to use them and that made you excited, that's where you can find some of the ones I played with. And Firefox maybe too. This is a post by Jeff Griffiths, who's from Mozilla in Vancouver. And when we were at JSConf, he decided to just sort of lay the hammer down and be like, "Hey guys, this stuff is sort of catching on. We should do it in Mozilla." And right, so going back to WebKit, there's no way for me to know exactly what's going on with Safari. I mean, the technology is there for them to expose this stuff for developers, and it wouldn't be very hard for them just to click a button that says, or not click a button, but have a toggle that says enable Shadow DOM support. So I'm really hoping that Safari does reveal this stuff soon. So wrapping up, Shadow DOM and Web Components offer encapsulation and modularity for your front-end code. I hope I sold you on that. And you should use this stuff and talk about it. Browser devs do notice. Thanks for coming. I will post these slides. I'll probably post the JSConf ones because they're already out there and they have everything all complete for you. Follow me on Twitter if you want those, and also if you like pictures of baby pandas. And I can be reached at Angelina@steamclocksw.com with questions. Also, you can tweet at me. I'm actually very friendly and like talking about this stuff, so come ask me your questions, and I can forward your feedback on to the browser developers and stuff like that. So thank you.